This is the story of a street clock's journey starting with its purchase from the Seth Thomas Clock Company in 1924 and ending at the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, Connecticut, 100 years later. The story begins at the First National Bank of Mount Hope, West Virginia. In 1910, there was a devastating fire in the town that left just a shell of the building that housed the bank. At the time of the fire, there was no post clock in front of the building. On September 24, 1924, Patrick Henry Garrett, president of the First National Bank, purchased a four-dial post clock number 2436 from the Seth Thomas Clock Company office in New York City for $1,000 with an additional $300 spent on installation of the clock. This etching from the bank stationery shows the clock in front of the bank building. The clock would be a fixture in downtown Mount Hope for almost 50 years. During the Great Depression, a boy named William Tweal was selling newspapers in Mount Hope. He recalled many years later about how he was thrown out on his ear one rainy day when he entered a prominent store. When he looked up among his scattered papers, he remembers seeing the Seth Thomas post clock. 40 years later, he would play a role in the clock's story. This picture, taken in the 1950s, shows the clock still standing proudly on Main Street. It would continue to tell the local residents the time as they strolled through town, shopping, or headed to the local theater for another 20 years. By 1973, the clock was in a state of disrepair and would start a new chapter in its story. It had been repainted from its original dull black with gold rings to a two-tone white and green. First National Bank was no longer in the original building, which was now occupied by a local dentist. On the 23rd of August, 1973, William Tweal Sr., the young man who recalled looking up at the street clock during the Great Depression, purchased the clock from Geraldine Garrett, the wife of Patrick Garrett, who originally purchased the clock from the Seth Thomas Clock Company. The clock now begins its first journey from downtown Mount Hope to the residence of Bill Tweal in Huntington, West Virginia. As these pictures show, the process of disassembling and moving a 2-ton street clock is no small feat. After receiving the clock at his residence, Bill spent the next year and several $1,000s restoring the clock. Once complete, Bill proudly placed the clock in his backyard where it had numerous visitors. One elderly couple stopped by to see the clock and told Bill they had gone to school by this clock when they were children. Frank Ramey of St. Louis, Missouri, told Bill he admired the clock for many years. He said his grandmother hauled mail and payroll through Mount Hope in the 1920s, riding in a Model T Ford with a .45 caliber pistol strapped around her waist. In 1983, Bill Tweal passed away. The clock would now make another journey to the home of his son, Dr. William Ted Tweal of Mechanicsville, Virginia. This is a picture of Dr. Tweal with his mother Eleanor Tweal, taken when the clock was being disassembled for moving from Huntington, West Virginia to Mechanicsville, Virginia. The last few years had taken a toll on the clock. It had fallen victim to vandalism, inclement weather, and a lack of maintenance. One of the dials was broken and the wooden bezels were rotted and broken. It would go through a complete restoration. The first step, as before, was the disassembly and movement of the clock. The cranes and vehicles are newer, but the process was the same. After disassembly and removal, the restoration process began. The cast iron components were sandblasted inside and out. Broken parts of the base were repaired. All screw bolts were replaced. DuPont Imron gloss black enamel was applied inside and out and to the weight. Gold leaf paint was applied to highlight external features. The movement was disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated. One gear was restored, and original color paint applied to the movement frame. The dials and bezels also had to be restored. Old paint was removed, a new dial was fabricated to replace the broken one, and the faces were resurfaced and the dials repainted. Once the restoration of the components was completed, reassembly began. A concrete pad was poured and electrical wiring was run through the pad for the lights. The bottom section was lowered over the weight, then the midsection, followed by the globe. With the frame complete, the installation of the movement, linkages, lights, and the dials finished the job. The clock is again running and telling time at its third home in Mechanicsville, Virginia. As before, its dial shone brightly at night and continued to mark the passing of time through all seasons. In 2010, Ted Tweel and his wife were downsizing and looking for a new home for the Seth Thomas Post Clock. Ted wanted the clock to be in a location where it would be appreciated and properly cared for. The decision was made to donate the clock to the American Clock and Watch Museum for its final trip back to Connecticut, where its journey had begun. And so the same process began for a fourth time. A team consisting of Peter Nunes, Tom Manning, and Mel Brown went to Virginia to move the clock. The clock was disassembled and loaded on a truck and trailer for the journey north to New England. Parts of the clock were delivered to the Electric Time Company in Medfield, Mass. For restoration, while others were delivered directly to the American Clock and Watch Museum. Cast headers were designed for the globe to be annotated with the American Clock and Watch Museum initials. All the castings were stripped and prepped for repainting. The dials were again restored. The castings are painted, new headers installed on the globe, dials and hands restored, and the clock is ready for installation. Though it would take longer than originally planned to complete the restoration and prepare the location for the post clock at the museum, the day did finally come. On the 100th anniversary of the purchase of Seth Thomas Post Clock number 2436, it is again standing proudly, this time in Bristol, Connecticut, not far from its original home of manufacture in Thomaston. It will continue to tell time to visitors of the American Clock and Watch Museum and the surrounding community. May it do so for another 100 years for future generations to enjoy. If you would like to see the Seth Thomas 4-dial post clock and explore a whole museum of tower clocks, house clocks, watches, and other horological objects, come visit the American Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, Connecticut.